This lesson is Psychopathology, it's paper 1 and we're looking at phobias. This section will be split into 2 parts. So this first part we're going to look at characteristics of phobias and behavioural explanations for phobias. So for characteristics of phobias, you need to be aware of 3 different characteristics: cognitive, behavioural and emotional. You can get short mark questions, multiple choice questions or questions with an item based on this topic. So here are the characteristics of phobias. Take some notes. Cognitive characteristics. Selective attention. So this is all to do with the thought processes of someone who is suffering from a phobia. Selective attention is the idea that you would pay attention only to that phobic stimuli and you would worry and think about that phobic stimuli more than anything else. Then we have irrational thinking. So this is when your thinking is maladaptive and it doesn't really make sense. So for example, if someone had a fear of clowns, they would think things like, this clown is going to kill me. It would be very irrational, because if we're being rational about it, it's not likely that a clown is going to want to kill you. He's probably there for entertainment purposes. Then we have behavioural characteristics. So this is all to do with the way that someone who is suffering from a phobia, how they behave. So the first one is panic. So they would cry or run away from when they are confronted with that phobic stimuli. Or they would avoid the phobic stimuli. So this could be, for example, using clowns again, not going to birthday parties just in case there would be a clown there. Then we have emotional characteristics. These are how it makes you feel. So how does someone who's suffering with a phobia, how do they feel emotionally? So they would have an extreme and persistent fear. Most of us experience fear on a regular basis, but their experience of fear, it would be persistent. It would never go away, and they would be constantly feeling that deep anxiety, and their nervous system would be reacting all of the time. So that links into the next one, which is feelings of anxiety. So they would constantly worry about that phobic stimuli, and it would all kick off that fight or flight response. So they would have those kinds of feelings constantly if they're suffering from a phobia. So just to recap the characteristics of phobias, there's 3: cognitive, behavioural and emotional. Cognitive characteristics, you've got irrational thinking and selective attention. Behavioural characteristics, avoidance and panic. Emotional characteristics, fear and anxiety, and that fear is persistent. Okay, so now we're going to look at the behavioural explanation for phobias. So this links back to the behaviourist approach that we learnt about in paper 2, our approaches section. So what I'd like you to do is just a quick recap. Can you define classical conditioning and operant conditioning for me? So pause the video, try not to look back at your notes, try to do it off the top of your head to see what you can remember. Okay, so classical conditioning is learning through association, and operant conditioning is learning through reinforcement. For classical conditioning, you might remember we looked at Pavlov's dogs, and operant conditioning we looked at Skinner. It's really important, if you are doing a question on psychopathology in paper 1, to remember you shouldn't spend too much time talking about Pavlov or Skinner. You should just link classical and operant conditioning straight to phobias, because that's what the question will be focusing on, and you're unlikely to get any or many marks if you do talk about Pavlov and Skinner. They're not really relevant in this situation. Yes in paper 2, no in paper 1. Okay, so classical conditioning is learning through association. With regards to a phobia, this is when someone associates a neutral stimuli with a fear response. So if you wanted to pause now, you can take some notes. This is the idea that when someone develops a phobia, the phobic stimuli is the neutral stimulus, and they learn to associate that with a fear response. So I've got an example here, and I'll stick along the theme of clowns. So this could be, if someone saw a clown initially, then the clown might have jumped out at them, and that would have made them feel quite scared, okay? It wasn't the clown itself, like the makeup and the costume, that made them feel fear. It was the act of being like scared, so someone jumping out at them. The jumping out at them was the thing that caused the fear. But what that person would learn to do is they would learn to after several pairings, just associate the clown with the fear response. So as an equation, you can see at the bottom, and it's okay if you get a question and it says something like, Sally has a fear of balloons, one popped at a party, explains why Sally developed this fear through classical conditioning. You can draw an equation. So we'll use the clowns and then I'll go through the balloon one as well. So with regards to a clown, jumping out at someone is an unconditioned stimulus, and that gives a fear response, which is an unconditioned response. The clown is a neutral stimulus. This is associated with that jumping out, and this therefore leads to a fear response. Eventually, it'll just be the clown which becomes a conditioned stimulus and will lead to a fear response. If we're thinking about the balloon situation, so if someone has a fear of balloons, you would have loud bang as your unconditioned stimulus, and that would lead to fear, which is an unconditioned response. Then you would have a balloon, which is a neutral stimulus. This will be paired with the loud bang, which is an unconditioned stimulus, and lead to a fear response, which is an unconditioned response. And then eventually, the balloon will become a conditioned stimulus, and every time you're around a balloon, you will have the conditioned response of fear. Okay, so we've got some research supporting this, and this research is by Watson and Rayner, and it's on a boy called Little Albert. If you want to make some notes, you can do, and I will attach a key study sheet if you would like to fill it out on there. So here's the procedure. Watson and Rayner took a little boy. He was very young, under the age of 2, and they tried to condition him to have a fear of white rats. They sat him down, and they put a white rat in front of him, and initially he wasn't afraid of the white rat. Then what they did was they put the white rat in front of him, and then someone stood behind him, and they were banging a metal pole to make a really loud noise, and this made little Albert feel really scared. Eventually, after several pairings of the loud noise and the white rat, Albert started to show that he was afraid of the white rat. So that's our findings. It had become a conditioned response. Also, he actually started to generalise this response to other white, fluffy animals, so like rabbits as well. There's a really good clip that you can find possibly on YouTube, and it's original footage from the study, so you can see what they actually did. So, what I'd like you to do, a little activity, once you've got the study written down, make sure you've read through it and you understand what's happening, and to help you with that, I would like you to write this out as an equation, okay? So I want you to give me the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the neutral stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at that, and hopefully this will work. So I've written it down, so I'm not sure if you can quite see that. So we've got loud bang as our unconditioned stimulus, which equals fear, which is our unconditioned response. Then we've got the rat, which is a neutral stimulus, which is paired with the loud bang, which is our unconditioned stimulus, which leads to fear, which is our unconditioned response. Sorry, this isn't looking very good, but then we've got our rat, which is our conditioned stimulus, and fear, which is our conditioned response. Okay, so hopefully you've got that right. If you're struggling with your equations, you can just add a comment, or you can email me and I can send you some practice questions so you can have a go at writing those equations. So just to recap, so classical conditioning is learning through association. Our neutral stimulus, which becomes the conditioned stimulus, is always the phobic stimuli, so whatever they're afraid of, whether that's balloons, clowns, spiders, etc. Our unconditioned response, which becomes a conditioned response, is fear. And the support for this is the Little Albert study. So next we're going to look at operant conditioning. But before we do, it's really important for you to be aware that there's the idea that acquiring a phobia is a two-process model. First of all, you have classical conditioning, and then our second stage is operant conditioning. So we learn the fear through association, and then the fear is reinforced and sustained through operant conditioning. And you can make some notes, from that there, so you can see it's a two-process theory or a two-process model. So just to reiterate, the first stage of acquiring a phobia is classical conditioning, so this is learning through association, and then the second stage is through reinforcement, so operant conditioning. The fear is sustained and continued through reinforcement. So with operant conditioning, we've got this idea that we have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, and these are the two key things that we discuss when we're talking about phobias. So not punishment, just positive and negative reinforcement. If you want to pause it now and make some notes, that would be a good idea. So, positive reinforcement. This is the idea that a fear is strengthened, or a phobia is strengthened, through reinforcement. So it's this idea that when you show a fearful response, you get some reward for that behaviour. So the basic example, if we link it back to little Albert, every time he showed fear, he got attention. So he got cuddles, and people were trying to make him feel better because he was upset. And this can work with lots of different phobias. So for example, if you have agoraphobia and you don't leave your home, and people bring food to you, and people come to your house and see you, then that's positive reinforcement, because people are coming to help you, and people are coming to make you feel better, and they're bringing you things, so you don't actually need to go out. So you've got a bit of positive reinforcement there. Then we have negative reinforcement. This is where you avoid a negative consequence. So for example, little Albert would avoid all fairy white things. And by avoiding all fairy white things, it meant that he wouldn't see a white rat, and therefore he would feel better. Just like when we were talking about clowns earlier, if you don't go into a fancy dress shop or you don't go to a children's party, you avoid those, and therefore you feel better because you know that you're not going to feel that anxiety, that worry and that persistent fear, because you're not putting yourself in that situation in the first place. So one of the behavioural characteristics of a phobia was avoidance. So we can link avoidance to positive and negative reinforcement. So if you avoid the phobic stimuli, then that negatively reinforces it because you feel better. And then if there's no anxiety created there and you're feeling better, then that's a positive, and that's positive reinforcement, because by avoiding it, it makes you feel better. So that's negative and positive reinforcement working together. So just to recap, operant conditioning, which is the second stage in the two-process model, first stage being classical conditioning. This is where we talk about negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. So operant conditioning, negative reinforcement, you avoid the phobic stimuli so you feel better. Positive reinforcement, there are positive consequences either to this avoidance or to showing a fearful response. So now we're going to evaluate the behavioural explanation for phobia. So this includes classical and operant conditioning. We're going to evaluate them both together. So our evaluation, strengths. As you can see, we've got the idea that this behavioural explanation is good because we can use it to develop treatments, and we'll talk about the treatments in the second part of this lesson. You can use any research that shows that treatments are effective, or you can talk about the treatments a little bit if you are evaluating the explanations. You can link it back to show that it is a good explanation because we can develop treatments, therefore we can apply it to real life and we can use it to help individuals. If you get an economy question, you can use it to help people who are suffering from phobias and it's affecting their work. So what we can do is we can put them through a behavioural programme and therefore it will make them feel better. Also, these treatments are often successful. So in the next part you'll have some research that shows that there's a good success rate with one type of therapy for phobias, and you can use that research to evaluate it and say that these are the strengths of the behaviourist explanation, because it gives credibility to this explanation. If this explanation wasn't valid and it wasn't truthful and it wasn't reliable and consistent, then we wouldn't be able to use it to develop treatments, or if we did, these treatments wouldn't be effective. Because the treatments are effective, and because we can develop treatments and apply them to real life, it gives the behaviourist explanation credibility, and that is a strength. Limitations. There's quite a lot here, so you might want to pause it and make some notes. I've also on the assignment attached the PowerPoint, so you might want to go back through this and you can jot it down in a bit more detail. So with regards to limitations, the first one, not everyone who has a phobia can recall an incident. So some people might have a phobia of dogs, but they've never been bitten by a dog. So that makes it really hard to explain using the behaviourist explanation, because there has to be some kind of association that's made there. So sometimes people can't remember that. It could be that they've forgotten it and it did occur, maybe when they were very young, but it makes it very hard to verify. Secondly, the model is quite simple, okay? It's oversimplified. It ignores cognitive factors. We said that a cognitive factor of a phobia was irrational thinking, but what if irrational thinking was the cause of the phobia, and this idea of association wasn't the actual cause? So it could be that when we develop a treatment, we're focusing on the behaviourist explanation, and by focusing on the behaviourist explanation, we're actually ignoring the real reason why this person has developed this phobia. Maybe the person has developed this phobia because of the irrational thinking, and maybe it's something that we need to focus on and develop some cognitive behavioural therapy for that individual instead, okay? And the final point is this idea that, yes, it's a good model, and yes, we can use it to develop treatments. However, we can't use it to explain all phobias. So like I mentioned just a minute ago, some people can't recall an incident. Seligman came up with this idea of biological preparedness, and he actually said that we are more likely to make an association between a stimuli and a fear response if that stimuli is linked to our evolutionary survival. So this is why people are more likely to have fears of spiders, darkness, snakes, heights, because each of these would have helped us survive. So it could be that these fears, these innate fears, they could be biological. It could be that we are biologically prepared to make these associations quicker. So that means that it's not just the behaviourist approach, it's something inside us as well. It's something that we've evolved to do. So these two things are working together. Also, it could explain why these fears are more common and why we can't use it to explain all fears. So like agoraphobia, where someone has a fear of like open spaces, and a fear of not being able to escape certain situations, it could be that the behaviourist approach is not the correct way of explaining that, and we need a different explanation. So each of these evaluation points really focus on the idea that the behaviourist explanation is an incomplete explanation. It ignores things such as our evolution, it also ignores cognitive factors, and we can't always explain why someone has developed a phobia because sometimes there's limited evidence that would suggest that there has been an association made. So to summarise our evaluation points, our strengths, we've got that there's treatments and they have high ecological validity because we can apply this to real life. And then our limitations, it can't explain all phobias. Some people don't remember an association being made. It ignores cognitive explanations such as irrational thinking, which we know is a cognitive characteristic of phobias, and also it ignores the idea of biological preparedness, which is linked to our evolution. Okay, so to summarise the lesson, we've got a few key words here. What I'd like you to do is pause the video. I would like you to try and explain or define as many keywords as you possibly can off the top of your head. Any that you can't, go back and make notes about it, and try and do a link me activity. So write the keywords down and try and link as many together and explain how they link in as many ways as possible. So for example, I would put a link between classical conditioning and Little Albert, and I would explain that link, because I would say Little Albert was classically conditioned to fear white rats because an association was made between a white rat and a loud bang that led to a fear response, and eventually the white rat became a conditioned stimulus. Okay, so have a go at those activities. If you do like a mind map for your link me activity and you want me to check it, then again just attach it when you hand in your work in. And once you've finished the lesson, I'd like you to complete the quiz on Google Classroom.